It is September 17th, and the commander of the Southwestern Front has been given the permission from Stalin and ordered a retreat. However, it is too late, and his armies have been surrounded on all sides by the Germans. As Kyiv falls, General Zhukov prepares Leningrad for a fight to the last man. In the center, Field Marshal Bock readies his forces for an offensive to end the war once and for all. We left off last week with the closing of the Kyiv pocket. Along with the capital of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, the vast bulk of the Southwestern Front was trapped inside. Guderian and Kleist had fought hard for weeks and managed to link up southeast of the city. Many of Stalin's generals had pleaded with him to allow a retreat of the front, but he had declined. Now, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers trapped inside, we will see this week what the Soviet dictator plans to do as we cover the third week of September from the 17th to the 23rd. Every week we release 3 new exclusive videos for our members and patrons. The Pacific War, the Eastern Front of World War II Prelude, and many other series, including the War of Spanish Succession, Punic Wars, Iberian Reconquista, Russian Revolution and Civil War, North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, and much more. It has been long overdue, but we have finally created a YouTube channel exclusively for our Kings and Generals podcasts. Please go and check out Kings and Generals podcast, home to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, link in the description and pinned comment. To see those, as well as get access to our exclusive Discord, see our schedule, and get early access to all videos, join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job. The fighting for Leningrad was nearing a critical point. Zhukov had been sent in to take command during the second week. With his typically energetic approach, he set about restructuring the entire defensive plan for the city. Before he had arrived, the defense had been on the verge of collapse. He refused to allow this sort of degradation in morale under his command. Multiple officers, who seemed to have succumbed to defeatism, despair, or refused to commit to counterattacks, regardless of excuse, were replaced on the spot. This is an often overlooked element of command. The ability to maintain composure after weeks of defeat is essential in any army, but was critical to the Red Army's ability to continue fighting after sustaining several of the worst defeats in military history. Draconian proclamations would be issued to prevent the collapse of morale, such as "not a step back," "do not give up a single verst of land on the approaches to Leningrad." This would be reinforced on the 17th by Combat Order No. 64, which announced that any commander, political worker, and soldier who abandoned the designated line without explicit written permission would be immediately shot. At the end of last week, a German offensive had slammed into the 42nd and 8th Army, preempting a planned counterattack by the 8th Army. Lieb aimed to encircle the 55th Army and then flank the 42nd Army to strike into Leningrad, whilst isolating the 8th Army. Volodyarsky and Oritsk fell, creating the Oranienbaum pocket, which cut off a large amount of the 8th Army from Leningrad. Despite being pushed back, the defenders would hold long enough to allow the 55th Army to withdraw in good order, rather than being trapped in the encirclement hoped for by the Germans. Pulkovo furthermore would hold until the 19th, but the Soviets would manage to retain possession of the heights after a heavy tank battle against the 1st Panzer Division. The Germans would be stopped 12 kilometers from the city centre. The heavy fighting of the Pulkovo Heights, in combination with the Panzer and motorized divisions redeploying to Army Group Center, and the utter exhaustion of many German divisions, would lead to winding down of the fighting over the rest of the month. Army Group North's reports state 60,000 men were lost. This included many experienced NCO and junior officers who were irreplaceable. The Red Army's reports would state the 3 different fronts engaged against Army Group North had lost 316,639 men since the 10th of July. On the 24th, Lieb reported to the OKH that Army Group North could not continue offensive operations, but had no choice but to go on the defensive. While the Wehrmacht ground to a halt outside the city, Directive No. 1A 160141, issued on the 22nd of September, announced to the world Hitler's intention to erase the city from existence, even its military and port facilities. To achieve this, Leningrad was to undergo a close blockade and erase it from the earth by means of artillery of all caliber and continuous bombardment from the air. Whilst this week's fighting had flattened out the inner blockade line, no progress had been made towards cutting the Lake Ladoga supply route. fighting still occurred along the front line. The 8th attempted an offensive towards Krasnosello with 4 rifle divisions on the 19th, but the Germans counterattacked the next day. The 8th would be driven back to the Novi Pitagov-Petrovskaya line before managing to stabilize. West of Leningrad, the Neva Operational Group seized a bridgehead across the Neva River at Dubrovka, but failed to advance further, which was more successful than Kulik's 54th Army's matching offensive floundering towards Sinyavino. These 2 operations would later be named the First Sinyavino Offensive. Despite their dismal performance, it forced the transfer of forces from Europe and Army Group Center. Furthermore, it drew in the 8th Panzer Division and parts of the 96th Infantry Division from the fighting occurring to the south of Leningrad. Halder had long wished to strike at Moscow at the expense of the flanking army groups. In August, he had won Hitler over that Moscow should be targeted before the end of winter. However, he was not able to launch the offensive in August, as he had calculated it being possible only if no demands were made by the other 2 army groups. Instead, Guderian had been turned south, creating the Kyiv encirclement, whilst another motorized corps had been sent north to Toropets. Heavy fighting bogged down both flanking army groups for all of August and most of September. Yelna had been forced to be abandoned in the face of heavy Soviet attacks, despite its ideal position as an offensive bridgehead towards Moscow. Hitler and Halder had extremely different views on how to win the war, and arguments which should have been decided before the start of the invasion kept on recurring. Halder maintained that the capture of Moscow would win the war for Germany, even in the face of an army strategic study at the end of August, which admitted that operations would need to be continued into 1942, and future plans should be based on that assumption. At the end of August, Hitler instructed Halder to undertake operations against the Soviet armies west of Moscow, to defeat them one by one. Halder hijacked the plan aimed against Army Group Timoshenko at Vizama and changed it from a 2-pronged close encirclement into a 3-pronged offensive aimed directly at Moscow. Taking advantage of imprecise language in Hitler's directive, Halder stripped Army Group North and South of all the mobile forces possible. 4 infantry, along with 9 panzer and 4 motorized infantry divisions, would be siphoned towards Army Group Center during September. Bock would command 14 panzer divisions alongside 8.5 motorized divisions. This would be the greatest ever concentration of German mobile divisions. These would be supported by a further 47 infantry, 1 cavalry and 5 security divisions. 1.9 million men across approximately 78 large formations prepared for one last decisive battle. Operation Typhoon was named on the 19th of September as operational planning started in full. The 2nd of October was designated as the start date. Due to the extra travel distance, Guderian's forces would start 2 days earlier. However, as of the start of September, 30% of the tanks in the 3 panzer groups picked for the upcoming offensive were completely out of action. A further 23% were being overhauled in factories back in Germany. On average, 34% of the tanks were ready for action. The transfer of nearly 300 tanks from Germany improved this readiness by 10%. One source estimates that the 2 new panzer divisions possessed around 450 tanks, whilst all the other 12 panzer divisions could muster a rough total of 750 tanks. Furthermore, there was a shortfall of 22% of the required motor vehicles for the army group, with engineers predicting a rapid increase of losses in trucks soon after the offensive started, due to mechanical issues. Further tanks and trucks were available in Germany, but Hitler still desires to retain these for the creation of new panzer divisions. Such was the demand for replacement trucks that requisition squads from Guderian's Panzer Army got into firefights with parts of the 8th Army Corps over trucks captured in the Kyiv pocket. By the 26th of September, the Germans had suffered no fewer than 534,952 casualties, some 15% of the entire Barbarossa invasion force. However, only 385,000 replacements were received, leaving a 150,000-man shortfall. Additionally, the logistical situation for Army Group Center was dire for the month of September. The delivery of trains never came close to the required 30 trains a day, even before flooding blocked the movement of supplies for 8 days. At the same time, incessant skirmishes and artillery duels occurred across the entire front, ensuring high supply consumption. Ammo and fuel had to be brought up for stockpiling, at the expense of everything else. Soldiers lived off the land. Throughput issues of supplies were worsened by the chaos behind the lines, causing wrong items to be delivered, like mudguards instead of engine parts. winter uniforms were planned to be delivered in early November for the small garrison force staff officers thought would be required. The planners had decided the army would have won sufficiently enough by then for other logistical concerns to be met. These would also be eased by the demobilization of 1/3 of the army to allow young men to return to the factories. Paradoxically, the preparations for Typhoon was the greatest concentration of strength for the Wehrmacht, whilst managing to demonstrate its rapid decline since the start of Operation Barbarossa. Guderian's panzer group had only just finished closing the envelopment behind Kyiv before they received orders to march north at the first available moment. They had a well-stockpiled supply depot at Romny, but his transport truck fleet was all but broken. The panzers had been stationary for almost a week, and still fuel and even rations were becoming scarce. At one point they had to resort to airdrops by the Luftwaffe. The 47th Panzer Corps diary noted on September 18th, "As a result of the heavy demands over the last weeks on outrageously bad roads, the state of the trucks has worsened. Owing to the failure to deliver spare parts, innumerable instances of damage, often only relatively minor, cannot be repaired. This in part, therefore, explains the high percentage of non-serviceable trucks. They were in desperate need of a rest and refit period, but it was becoming clear that there would not be one." Instead, his men girded themselves for the inevitable breakout attempts as the Luftwaffe and infantry worked together to reduce the pocket. After that, they would have to move north and prepare for Operation Typhoon. The 5th Air Corps was intent on destroying as much of the southwestern front as they could. One officer boasted that the Luftwaffe was going to do half the work of the army. In the 3rd week of September alone, the 5th Air Corps dropped hundreds of thousands of pounds of bombs on the southwestern front. They were putting in levels of sorties not seen yet in the war. The 2nd Air Corps was also working overtime, hammering the Red Army in the Kyiv pocket. Together they destroyed thousands of vehicles of all types. The Luftwaffe essentially had complete air superiority at this time over the pocket. The VVS rarely sortied out in this sector, and when they did, they were often brushed aside by the Luftwaffe air cover. The few times they made it through to attack the panzers on the ground, they were broadly ineffectual. Still, losses mounted for the Luftwaffe. Every plane lost was essentially irreplaceable. On June 22nd, they had started the campaign with 2,995 airframes of all types. By the time the pocket was closed behind the southwestern front, they had attritioned to less than 1,000 operable airframes. The commander of the 2nd Air Fleet reported to higher headquarters in September that the Luftwaffe was simply overtaxed and at the end of their tether. The 6th Army, under Field Marshal Reichenau, was ordered to assault Kyiv. The city may have been encircled, but it was still well defended and had the highest concentration of Red Army soldiers in the pocket. However, on the 16th, Kyiv had received oral permission from Timoshenko and his commissar Khrushchev to withdraw to the Psel River, but refused without written confirmation. This would be received on the evening of the 17th, but only to abandon Kyiv. Nevertheless, Kyiv had already acted. The 5th, 21st, 26th and 37th Armies were to break out eastwards through the thin armoured line some 200 kilometers east from Kyiv. The 38th and 40th Armies were to attack Romny and Lubna to protect the flanks. It was too late. Out in the open and caught on the move, these columns fragmented under constant attacks and were forced into 3 large pockets and countless roving bands of troops. The fighting broke down in confused encounters. Soviet soldiers endeavored to break out no matter the cost. These attempts were often unplanned and haphazard affairs, with anything available thrown at the nearest German forces, causing heavy casualties for both sides. Elements of the 26th Army lasted the longest, until the 26th of September, before being overrun. Kyiv himself would die on the 20th, when his headquarters and elements of the 5th Army were overrun by the 3rd Panzer at Kryukivshchina Farm. The southwestern front had been 850,000 strong, including reserves and rear service troops on the 1st of September. Of the 700,544 casualties suffered since the start of Barbarossa, 616,304 would be inflicted during the Battle of Kyiv. Only 15,000 were estimated to have escaped the encirclement. 4 Soviet armies with 43 divisions virtually ceased to exist. This was achieved against the expert advice of Hitler's military professionals. Kyiv reinforced belief in Hitler's intuition, not just for Hitler himself, but for a small key cabal of generals in the OKH. Timoshenko had been made commander of the southwestern front on the 11th after Budeni was relieved of command for pressing for the evacuation of Kyiv. His initial optimism rapidly dissipated. His initial headquarters of Poltava had been overrun. Moreover, he now had to rebuild an entire front virtually from scratch, in addition to reforming a defensive line to protect the rest of Ukraine. The 29th Corps would capture Kyiv on the 19th. As German infantry moved into the city proper, they began to discover a horrifying new reality. Radio-controlled mines had been secretly installed in hundreds of buildings by the NKVD. On the 20th of September, the first detonation occurred. The explosives had been strategically placed in buildings where it was most likely that Germans would take up residence. Mass looting by the remaining civilians and some Germans worsened the situation. There was no power or running water, and food was scarce. On the 24th, bombs began to go off regularly. NKVD saboteurs worked to spread fires that were started by the bombs. There was a clear effort to destroy the city centre, as the fires began to grow out of control. The lack of running water in the city hindered any response. The explosions killed approximately 200 soldiers and an unknown number of civilians. These were relatively light casualties, but the morale impact was large. Many of the dead and wounded were staff officers. This impacted unit cohesion and amplified confusion throughout the city. The German occupational authorities blamed the Jews for this attack, despite how many of them had been victims of the fires. This would be used as justification for the Babin Yar atrocity at the end of the month. It would be the Germans' largest massacre to date. Even as the fighting was still going on, the next steps of the campaign were being planned. Guderian began his redeployment in places where he could be relieved by infantry. Kleiss was preparing to take his limited forces in a dash across the breadth of Ukraine to Donetsk and beyond. The lower Dnieper was still unsecured, and the 1st Panzer Group was directed to handle this along with their drive to Stalino. The 11th Army was ordered to prepare an attack on the Perekop Isthmus. The 6th and 17th Armies would continue to drive east and cover the Panzers' advance from the north. Some German officers even thought they might be able to end the year on the Don River. Rostov was still more than 500 kilometers to the east, but the mood was such that even this felt attainable in the wake of the victory. One success for the Red Army was the defenders of Odessa succeeding in a joint army, airborne and amphibious operation at Kryhorivka on the 21st. This expanded their defensive perimeter by 5 to 8 kilometers and pushed Romanian heavy artillery out of range of the harbour. In a week of disasters, such a small success is easily overshadowed, but would have been welcome news for the beleaguered Red Army. This concludes our discussion for this week. Next week we will continue the week-by-week account of the entire war on the Eastern Front. From June 1941 to May of 1945, we will track the war's progress. Stay tuned, and remember, this is just the beginning of the weekly Eastern Front of World War II series. Don't forget to subscribe, comment and share this video, it helps immensely. We have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.